Thank you for the opportunity to provide an update on a survey project that explores people's experience of after-death communications. We reported on this project at the PA Convention in 2019. At that stage, we gave an initial quantitative survey of responses, and this has led to a number of publications that are listed at the end. Today, I'd like to focus on one aspect of the analysis that bears most directly on the question of survival. We'd like to take this opportunity to gratefully acknowledge the kind support of the BL Foundation, the Society for Psychical Research Survival Fund, and an anonymous benefactor which has enabled this work to take place. We define our after-death communications, or ADCs for short, as follows. An ADC occurs when a person, often but not always during bereavement, unexpectedly perceives the deceased person in a manner that's interpreted as indicative of the continued survival of some aspect of that person. Our definition of ADCs is restricted to those instances that are spontaneous, that is, the contacts or communications are apparently initiated by the deceased without encouragement by or solicitation from the experience themselves. They're also direct in that they don't involve the intervention of another person, such as the mental medium, or technologies such as Ouija boards, instrumental transcommunication, the psychomantium, and so on. ADCs are described as communications because they're commonly understood to convey a message. We've summarized the typical types of message as the 4 R's. They can be reassuring, no matter what my troubles were at the end of life, I'm now fine, you don't need to worry about me. They can be resolving, we may not have left on good terms, but we can settle those old conflicts, we can make apologies, and we can provide closure. They're reaffirming of those old emotional bonds. I still love you and I will always be by your side. I'm watching out for you. And they can be releasing. Don't hold me back by your grief. You need to move on with your own life. Now, although research on encounters with the deceased has a long history, most notably the work of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in the late 19th century that was published in volumes such as Census of Hallucinations and Phantasms of the Living, modern interest is most often traced to an article by Dewey Rees that was published in the British Medical Journal in 1971. Now, Rees was a general practitioner. In the US, I think he would be called a primary care physician or a family doctor. And he managed a Welsh rural practice that had about 7,500 patients. His was a mature community with quite a lot of older patients, and he was aware that the death of a spouse frequently precipitated the death of the surviving widow or widower. So he decided to interview all the widowed people in his practice to see if he could identify factors that might be beneficial or obstructive to the bereavement process. During the course of his interviews, however, he was surprised to discover that almost half of the people he spoke to disclosed that they'd experienced hallucinations of their dead spouse. Now, he uses the term hallucination in the title of his paper, and it's intended to be ontologically neutral, in that it doesn't imply that such experiences are necessarily a consequence of disease or dysfunction, but it does acknowledge that they're likely to be subjectively generated. In fact, the experiences were quite common, being reported by nearly 47% of his interviewees, and their occurrence was not linked to variables that might suggest dysfunction or difficulty in coping, such as social isolation or depression. The form of the encounter varied, most commonly taking a form of sense of presence of the deceased, reported by 39% of cases, but also including visual, auditory, tactile components of reported experiences. A majority of those reporting encounters with their deceased spouse regarded them as helpful in their recovery from loss. And Rees concluded that these hallucinations were normal and beneficial accompaniments of widowhood. But at the same time, participant behavior suggested a reticence to disclose such experiences, perhaps out of a fear of ridicule or attributions of pathology, since 3/4 of them had never told a single other person about their experiences prior to disclosing them in Rees's interviews. There was an initial resurgence of interest that was rather sporadic following Rees's publication, but since the turn of the century that has picked up momentum and the experience has been taken more seriously as a subject of research interest. In the mainstream clinical setting, some of this work predictably presumes abnormality or pathology. For example, Castelnuovo and colleagues begin their review in the DSM with the DSM diagnosis category of, quote, persistent complex bereavement disorder. And this is characterized by severe and persistent grief and mourning reactions, and it lists, quote, hallucinations of the deceased presence, unquote, as an associated feature supporting such a diagnosis. Nevertheless, even in this review of published studies, the suggested prevalence rates range from 30 to 60%, and they acknowledge that only a minority of such cases involve distressing experiences or indicate a need for medical intervention. Other mainstream researchers, such as the International Consortium for Hallucination Research, led by Karina Camp, have concluded that the experiences are typically benign, especially where attempts are made to understand them within the context of the experience's own cultural and spiritual framework. Contemporary parapsychologists have also revived interest in ADCs, most notably the work of Elida Harrelson, for example in his book The Departed Among the Living, and also the work of Julie Beischel and her team at the Windbridge Institute that includes what they call assisted ADCs, things like mediumship, and facilitated experiences, such as with the psychomantium, alongside the spontaneous experiences that we're concentrating on today. Their work argues for the experiences to be normalized, but also remains open to the possibility that they have an ontological reality. That is, that the ADCs can provide evidence that bears on the fundamental question of survival following bodily death. Again, a theme that I'll focus on today. So it's in this context that the present study was designed in order to map in more detail and with a much larger sample the phenomenology of ADCs, to explore the covariates and their effects on the percipient, particularly in relation to recovery from the loss of a loved one. Last time we reported on the basic features of experiences, including modality of the experience and their impacts. Time limits allow only a brief recap of those features. The survey was online using a questionnaire that comprises 194 questions, so it's quite substantial. However, these questions are presented intelligently, with earlier responses deciding which follow-up questions will appear, so respondents don't necessarily see all 194. The survey was created in 3 languages to broaden reach and potentially enable cross-cultural comparisons. And rather than have a target number of respondents, each survey was live for a pre-specified period. It was important to us that we began by asking participants to describe their experiences in their own terms before we asked any of our own focused questions. This was intended to avoid the researchers setting the agenda for participants in terms of what features were salient and meaningful for them. This item alone generated over 150,000 words, for an average of 150 words per entry. They range from very cursory 3 or 4 words through to about 1,000 words in describing people's experiences, and they're the subject of ongoing qualitative analysis. Further questions asked about the modality of the experience and any features that were particular to that modality, such as the form or density of a visual experience. We also asked about the physical and emotional circumstances of the ADC in order to identify potential covariates. And we asked about the impacts of ADCs upon religious, spiritual, and existential beliefs, as well as their effects on the bereavement process and on their perceived relationship with the discarnate, where that was appropriate. We received a total of 1,004 completed responses. Initial screening removed 13 incomplete or spoiled submissions, leaving 991 viable cases. There was a large predominance of female respondents, but otherwise the demographics in terms of profiles of age, education and employment looks fairly representative of the wider population. One of the most surprising features of our sample was the prevalence of different types of ADC. Other researchers have found sense of presence experiences to be the most common, for example with Dewey Reese, but here they make up the smallest proportion. This could partly be due to sampling differences, with our volunteer sample perhaps not regarding sense of presence experiences as sufficiently evidential to warrant the investment of so much time in completing such an extensive survey. They may remain subjectively persuasive, but not be regarded as persuasive to other people. In contrast, however, dream-mediated experiences were the most common here. Dewey Reese and other researchers haven't even asked about sleep experiences. And they also suffer from the same kinds of perceived weaknesses as the sense of presence cases, but clearly didn't deter people from reporting them. Moving on then to the features that pertain to the survival hypothesis, we note that although the vast majority of experience are convinced of the authenticity of their own experience, ADCs are by their nature intrinsically subjective, and therefore susceptible to explanation as a psychological response to a deep emotional need. People profoundly affected by the death of a family member or a friend might have this need addressed by constructing perceptions of their loved one in a manner that might give them some hope for their continued existence, at least in some form. The types of experience that are most resistant to such counter-explanations include those that occur while the person is fully awake and in good sensory conditions for visualizing or perceiving the experience. People who report experiences when they're not in bereavement, especially where they perceive unknown deceased persons. Contacts that occur during which previously unknown information is perceived, and those situations in which the experience is shared with another person. And that's going to be the focus for the rest of today's talk. Moving to the first of these, experiences such as ADCs are associated in popular culture with nighttime, when people might be prone to overinterpret ambiguous stimuli. In our sample, it is true that experiences were most likely to occur at nighttime, but many were reported to have happened in the morning or afternoon when lighting conditions were better and the respondent was wide awake. In the modern era, of course, even experiences in the evening or nighttime might not involve dark conditions, and 15% of those cases were reported in electric light. Another aspect of conventional explanations is that percipients are primed to overinterpret stimuli when they're deeply in mourning, as they're susceptible to wishful thinking. And half of our sample were still in mourning for the loved one, but half were towards the end of their bereavement process, or indeed had never been in mourning at all for the person whom they had the experience with. Nevertheless, a large majority regard their experiences as profoundly meaningful, and they treasure them. Moving to the third type of experience, a quarter of our sample, or 236 people, reported that they perceived information from the ADC that was previously unknown to them. When asked to elaborate on this information, many accounts are disappointingly vague. For example, quote, future events regarding me and my daughter, end quote. Or, quote, she described a situation several days away that should have killed me, end quote, without elaborating on the circumstances or the detail of those, which was very frustrating. Or there may be platitudes such as that he was happy and content, that he had passed over, he was relieved not to be in pain anymore. Or they're unverifiable, they might refer to aspects of that afterlife. For today, I'll focus on those cases that seem to be more evidential, or at least verifiable, to give you a flavour of their content. And so I'll quote a few of those cases. So a common form of previously unknown information relates to the very fact of the death of the deceased person, which itself may not have been expected. So for example, and this is English case 268, that's the little bit in box brackets after the quote, and she reports, I awoke suddenly for no reason from a good sleep, and saw my grandfather standing at the side of my bed. He seemed slightly younger, healthier, and radiating pure love. He smiled at me and said, I'm going away, my wee dove, which was his pet name for me. I smiled back at him and looked at my alarm clock. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. Then he was gone. It didn't occur to me to ask my grandfather where he was going or why he was in my room at 6 in the morning. I just slipped back into a peaceful sleep. I was later awakened by the telephone ringing and my grandmother sobbing on the phone that Papa was dead. His death certificate later stated that the approximate time of death was 6 a.m. Other cases similarly might involve deaths that were expected, but the actual time was unknown, and there seems to be a focus on time stamping their experiences. So another case from our English sample, my mother was not anticipated to live more than a few days. I was in bed around midnight and suddenly sensed her presence at the side of my bed. She spoke my name and patted my shoulder. I felt Mom had passed. Within 10 minutes, my brother phoned to tell me that she'd died a few minutes before his call to me. Others involve people who are not in the percipient's current social circle, so they have no expectations that they're close to death at all. Indeed, they may not have thought about that person at all recently, so that the experience comes as a surprise. So for example, one of our French sample, on Thursday, June 25th, I woke up at 1:20 a.m. I thought I'd had a nightmare. This man, whom I hadn't seen for years, had just told me that he was dead. He was sitting on a white bed in a white place. I thought of a hospital room. We had a long conversation. The next day, I unfortunately forgot everything, but the Sunday that followed, my best friend called me to tell me that this person had died on Thursday and that his burial was good to take place next Monday. I understood at that moment that I had not had a nightmare, but that he'd come to tell me himself that night. Or one from our Spanish sample. One night I woke up and saw my biological father. He greeted me and said that he came to tell me that he was leaving and that he had left me a small inheritance. He said that he'd met my children and that I had a beautiful family. He said goodbye with affection and left. I never had contact with him. I didn't meet him in person. I learned of his existence when I was 9 years old, when I found out that my father, with whom I grew up and whose surname I have, was not my biological father. However, I never saw nor did he a reunion, and we didn't meet personally until after his death. 2 days after the experience, his family contacted me to notify me of his death and his desire that I receive an inheritance that he had left me, which confirmed to me that my experience was real and accurate. Sometimes the information related to the living person's ongoing situation, for example, in helping to locate something that's lost. I've chosen the following examples for their brevity rather than their evidentiality. So from the English sample, in the months after he passed to spirit, a friend told me that my partner had been given 2 negative photos of us. I had no idea he had these negatives. The friend wanted them back so that they could make copies. I searched our box of negatives in vain. So, writing a posthumous letter to my partner, I said, if he'd been given the negatives, could he somehow tell me where they were? The next day in the kitchen, the clear telepathic sentence came in my head. The negatives are on the top shelf of the larder. Thinking this was ridiculous, I nevertheless climbed on the chair, and there were the 2 negatives in an envelope. And others described quite briefly. The most significant was in a dream. I'd lost something very important to me, a ring. In fact, my niece and her friends had lost it unintentionally, and my grandmother in dreams told me the exact place where she was. I often feel her presence through aromas that remind me of it and were very characteristic of it. And also might relate to other family circumstances, such as a secret wedding, or in this case, that their daughter was pregnant, and at this time she didn't even know that herself until she performed a test. That sense of watching over also extends to cases that are interpreted as a warning. These ADCs suggest that the deceased person communicated with the purpose of helping their loved one avoid a potentially dangerous situation. So, for example, my husband was worried when a box of controlled drugs and we own a pharmacy, went missing, and he spent days searching for the stockroom and the controlled drugs cabinet. He went in on a Sunday for one last look before having to report it and presumably get into some trouble. He was upstairs just staring at the cabinet when he heard my mum say, "Look behind the radiator." He reached down behind, and wedged in there was the box of diamorphine. Or this one that involves avoiding an accident. On a country road in winter, I just finished my work. It was dark. I had no radio. Suddenly, in my left ear, I hear a voice say to me very, very calmly, "Careful, my daughter, on the right." I wasn't driving very fast, but I found myself putting on the brakes anyway. And about 20 meters further on the right, 2 large black cows were crossing the road. They were as black as night, and I couldn't have seen them. I can't explain how I know it was my father, who died a few months earlier, beyond the fact that he always called me my daughter when he spoke to me. I just know it was him. Tears came to my eyes. I always felt him around me soon after his death. The final type of case that might be more challenging to explain away involves shared experiences. Although a third of our respondents were not alone when they had their ADC, for 3/4 of these cases, they were the only one to perceive the contact. However, this still leaves us with 115 cases where a second person is claimed to in some way have shared that experience. And we'll give you some examples of those in the following. So a very brief one. In a library, the very real apparition of an uncle who died many years ago. He was also seen by a young man sitting next to me. 48 hours after my daughter's death, I was in my room with a friend in the late evening. We were discussing something else. Suddenly, my daughter came and hugged us both at the same time. She put her hand on each of our backs. We were startled and exclaimed, "Marianne." Of course, all the names in these transcripts have been changed to preserve anonymity. My deceased father-in-law, Henry, had been at a distance in the corner of the room, so as an ADC. My sister-in-law felt cold and suddenly asked me what was wrong. And then the cat, asleep on my lap, sprang up, arched back and fur standing up, claws dug into my leg, staring at the same corner of the room where Henry was. She would never go near that corner, even if she was not fed. From that point onward, she was not fed for 2 days, and her food was put down right there. She was frightened to go near that area. And then a longer example, which, if you indulge me, kind of talks about a shared experience in the sense that they are separate experiences, but they're convergent. So one afternoon during my daily nap on the sofa in the living room, I had a dream, but I wasn't really asleep as I was in between two waters. I see Caroline. She has a face that reveals a serious situation. She looks gravely at her family, which I cannot see, her husband and three children. Then I see her turn towards a light that I see shining behind her. Her face lights up with a wonderful smile, the one that she used to wear. I understand that she has a choice and prefers to leave. My vision stops when my mobile rings. It's Danielle, Caroline's mother, calling me in tears without being able to say a word. I understand and I knew that Caro had simply passed away. I have trouble finding my words, but I managed to show Danielle all my empathy and affection on the phone. My wife, who was taking a nap in our room, was awakened by the telephone conversation. She comes to me and I tell her the bad news and she says, I just saw her in my dream, dressed in her usual casual clothes, and she told me that she had to go. I say, yes, she came to see me too. And after that, we never saw her again. So this gives you a very brief run through some of the cases that we've collected in our survey study, and gives you a flavour of the features that people often report. To summarise the details of the project to date in this short time, I'd conclude that few experiences occurred under conditions that are conducive to misperception or faulty recall, though many do involve sleep-related states where reality monitoring is diminished. A quarter reported that they received previously unknown information during their communication, but unfortunately, many of these accounts are vague or partial. Some of that could be recovered if we adopted an interview strategy rather than a survey strategy, where there's much less scope for follow-up questions with people. More detailed accounts particularly relate to unexpected deaths, but also to factual information such as lost objects. And there's also a sense of benign oversight, even extending into future events which are not yet determined. In terms of future work, we're currently extending the survey to include Dutch and German language versions, and we're also exploring the possibility of extending to non-Western cultures to see whether the features of these ADCs might differ in those communities. And especially as we began, so we end, our outreach very much focuses on normalizing anomalous experiences such as ADCs, so people feel able to share them with others and to process them and make sense of them. So thank you for your attention. Here's a list of the publications. I'll leave this slide up for a moment or two. And if you'd like to follow up, there's details also of a dedicated website that describes features of this project and provides links to some of the other online talks that we've given in relation to it. I very much look forward to responding to your questions and to the chat during the rest of this conference. Thank you for your attention.